Hi, welcome back to the Benchmarkers Rugby Show. My name is Kumbi, and we finally come to the conclusion of the Six Nations after a couple of months. Ireland managed to take the championship. They managed to win it. Wasn't necessarily a grand slam. I think they'll be disappointed with that. I think that would probably have been their goal, but they fell to to England at Twickenham in the fourth round. They lost to England in the fourth round, but then they still managed to beat Scotland to win it in the final weekend. And this was an amazing tournament. And yeah, I think look, d- based on the competitiveness of this tournament, because even the worst team here, which was Wales, right? So they were really competitive in certain moments of every single game that they played. So it was a very impressive tournament. It was a good watch for rugby fans around the world. But for this video, we're going to talk about Ireland, right? So basically, we're going to talk about the different stats in different areas, how they did in those areas, and even though this video is going to be focusing on Ireland, we're also just going to talk about briefly about how the other teams performed as well as we look at each of the stats. Right. Okay. So we're going to start off with the scoring, right? So obviously the big thing with Ireland, especially for the first, I think it was the first three rounds, right? So the game against France, Italy, and I'm forgetting with Wales, right? So those first three games, high scoring, they were averaging mid 30s in every single game. So they came out on top for tries scored, tries and points scored, and I think it was mostly because of those first three rounds. I think they racked up so many that they just managed to stay up ahead the rest of the teams. But I think it's very important to note though that even though they did lose to England, high scoring game, but even that last game against Scotland, it's always impressive to see a team that is able to win in different ways, right? So your attack isn't really working. The other teams, right? So for that game, Scotland's attack was actually much better than Ireland's. Well, at least stats wise, right? They did put Scotland under pressure, but it wasn't, they weren't really able to find as much purchase as they had in previous rounds. But they still managed to win the game. They still managed to dominate the game because they've got some core fundamentals that they're getting right within their team. So yeah, so scoring, Ireland is doing really well. England, France, basically are the two teams that are following, and then you've got the other teams, three teams. Basically, this is obviously following what we're seeing in the table. So yeah, so that is the first metric that we'll look at, and then we're going to look at some set pieces. Set piece was very weird for the Six Nations for the whole tournament. I think all six teams in this tournament will leave this tournament thinking they have to improve in their scrums. The best team scrum wise in the tournament. Oh, by the way, basically the way that these stats have been ordered within these tables is that the team with the best stat for that, or at least the highest number, is going to be on top, and then we ordered them in that way. So second is in the second row, and then third in the third row, and third in the third row, and so on. So France, if you look at the scrum stats, France has the highest percentage, even though they've got the second lowest amount of scrums. The few scrums that they did get, they did quite well compared to everyone else, 84%. But that's not a very good number, right? If you're playing a test match level, you probably want to be in the late 80s, early 90s, right? At the very least. If you look at a team, for example, like Ireland, right? I think technically they've got some things wrong. I think they've got very good personnel there. Think they can work on those things, but looking way down, especially the last three teams, Italy 73, Scotland 69, those are not test numbers. Wales 65. Wales is facing South Africa. Ireland is also facing South Africa in June, July, in that period. Both teams will really want to improve, especially Wales, because if you go to South Africa, you're going to be facing guys like Oxenchair over there. It's going to be ugly if you don't sort this out. Even Ireland, 81%, that's not a good enough number. So yeah, that's scrums. But if you look at the lineouts, I think that the teams basically generally did well in the lineouts. You've got Ireland and England who are operating around that 91% region. Both teams actually had identical numbers in the lineouts. I think it was like 62 out of 68 in total for both. 62 out of 68 for both. And then France, Wales operating that late 80s or mid to late 80s, and then Scotland is in that mid 80s, who's got 85, and then Italy's early 80s. If your worst performing lineout team is 83%, that's not too much of a bad performance, to be honest. So I think lineouts, Six Nations, the Northern Hemisphere teams are doing really well. it's just the scrums and the set piece. Because what I will stress this again: if England is going to be facing New Zealand, I think I might be wrong on this. If I'm wrong, please do correct me. England is facing New Zealand. Wales is facing South Africa. Ireland is also facing South Africa. I think Wales is just the one game. Those teams, scrum wise, if you look at New Zealand, guys like Tyrell Lomax right now are performing really well. Those, guys like Ethan de Groot, the young guys that they had in the World Cup, their scrum is going to be a very big weapon that they can use, especially with a guy like Jason Ryan coaching. So you have to fix these if you are these Northern Hemisphere teams. And then, the fancy stats, right? So the next stats is going to be the attacking stats. So if you look here, again, it's no surprise that Ireland is doing well for most of these. Carries, the highest. Meters carried, they're the highest with 2,217. Line breaks, they're the highest. Offloads, they're actually third, right? So Scotland and France are the best teams for those two stats specifically. And, I think Scotland was... I think it's a very interesting period because right now with a lot of 10s either injured, guys like Dan Bigg, I don't know if he's retired or retired, right? You've got guys like Richie Mwang who've gone off. You've got Johnny Sexton who's gone. A lot of teams are missing their 10s. So it's time for a lot of these teams to bring in new playmakers into their teams. And you've got guys like Finn Russell. And I think I mentioned this in a previous video where it's time for guys like Finn Russell to basically stand out as the best 10 in the world. And as far as him controlling the game, opening up the game with his kicking, passing, playmaking, he's done quite well in this tournament, right? So it's no surprise that in something like offloads, they're doing really well in that metric. And then France is also a bit of a weird team, right? Because they're also number one in defenders beaten. Ireland is number 2 this time. And obviously, the big question with France is they were missing their playmakers, right? So Roman Tamak was missing. Antoine Dupont is gone, right, for the year. So it was going to be interesting to see the product that they would have come up with. I had predicted that they'll come third in the tournament. They ended up coming first because, England basically fumbled it at the end of that game. But France is an interesting team. They are one of those teams that like to blood in talent, especially they usually take that little June test period to do that, right? So I don't think they'll be too concerned because they know that their players are coming back. They're young, they're coming back. They've got a very good core. You've got all these under-20 teams that keep winning every single year. They're the best teams at the junior level, right? So you've got guys who are going to be coming back. I think for 2027, they're going to be feeling confident. If they can stay number 2 at this level, they're going to be disappointed not to beat Italy. But I think it's promising. It's still promising if you can still open up teams, get a good number. You can still basically have that flow of game, that game style that they're used to when even their best players are on there. I think it's looking bright for France, in my opinion, right? So attacking numbers, as you can see, Ireland is doing quite well, right? So I think they won the Six Nations because of their set piece and because of their attack, right? So the set piece gave them a very good platform to then, attack, because obviously they've got some really good players, guys like Bundy Aki, who can give you a good go forward. They've got a very good forward pack. They basically retained most of their forward pack. It's going to be interesting to see if Omani retires, but that's basically what won them the tournament. Those first 3 tests, they were basically far ahead of everyone else. But then if you look at the defensive numbers, though, they're not doing quite well when it comes to the defensive side of the ball. And this is the area that if you're Ireland, you have to look at this and say, if we don't fix this, when we go to when you go to South Africa, this is going to be a big problem. Obviously, Southern Hemisphere teams kind of struggle usually in that June test series because they're also starting their test period. So they need a game or 2 to get into the mix of things. But with South Africa, they get to play Wales, who are basically in the Six Nations, according to performance so far. They're the worst team so far, right? So they get to have that little practice game. And then they can play Ireland in that, I think it's the first weekend of July, right? And you're playing them at altitude as well. It's going to be in Pretoria. So if you're Ireland, you really have to sort yourselves out, right? Defensively, tackle. So I didn't put the total tackle numbers here because obviously based on possession and all that stuff, those can kind of skew the numbers. So basically, working on percentages, Ireland is working at 86.5%. Not too bad, but you really want to improve on that. France and Scotland are leading, and then England is lost surprisingly. But I think when it comes to England, it's one of those. They dominate the game. and then they kind of lose position. A lot of they had a lot of fumbles and all that stuff, a lot of handling errors. When they do that, they're not really recovering well enough to, so I think they're finding themselves on the back foot, and when they do that, they miss a lot of tackles. So that's why they're at the bottom. And then percentage dominant tackles. So out of the total tackles that you're attempting, or at least that you're making, what percentage of those are dominant? And I would have expected Ireland to be a lot higher than this because of their loose trio. They retained basically their loose trio of Van der Fleer, you have Omani, and, well, I always space out on at least one name, but basically they're 8. Caelan Doris, right? Caelan Doris, and you still have Jack Conan, right? So that's basically the core that you've kept from the World Cup, which was dominant. I would have expected them to be dominant coming into the Six Nations as well, which they were, but then the tackling, I think they could have put a little bit more oomph there. Because once again, if you're looking ahead to July, when you're playing against the Box, if you think back to the last game that the Box played, the way that they were so physical, Peter Steff was just hitting everything backwards, right? So you're going to need to be a little bit more dominant if you're the loose trio, if you want to go up against that Springboks loose trio. Turnovers, again, same point, right? So because their loose trio is basically experienced, they've come from the World Cup, they're the lowest. They've got the lowest number of turnovers, which is very surprising to me. Italy has basically over the double number of turnovers. I think you have to give Italy credit, by the way. Lamaro and his boys, very impressive so far. They've won 2. They should have won one more, but we're not going to get into that kind of controversy. But basically, I think that was very impressive. England basically work with number 8, who's a 7, so that's not surprising. And then Wales, number 3, turnover Tommy. That's something to build on for them, I think. And then moving on to penalties conceded, Ireland are close to the top, so that means the discipline is decent, right? So even when they find themselves on the back foot, like games like Scotland, they're not conceding too many penalties. But when they do find themselves under pressure, they're conceding yellow cards. Highest number of yellow cards with 5, and then Scotland at number 4, England 3, France 2, Italy 2, Wales surprisingly only 1, right? So yeah, so that's basically how they won it. In my opinion, it looks like they've basically won it based on their set piece. Set piece built a platform for the attack. You've got guys like Bandi Aki, who then managed to make use of that go forward, and obviously the finishers can then finish it out wide. So they attack, but they have to fix that scrum. They have to fix their defense in July, right? And then obviously now that the next test, I think the next test is going to be South Africa. I don't know if they've got a test before that, but the question then becomes, obviously there's been chats since like the second, third round of the Six Nations that Ireland is best team in the world. I don't think you can actually say that, right? Especially obviously given the fact that now they've been facing teams. Wales, they're going through a lot. France, they're kind of going through a rebuild. Scotland is always kind of iffy. England are going through a rebuild. They're going to be scary in the next couple of years. And I'm forgetting that Italy is coming up, right? I don't think they've faced enough opposition so far for us to say, well, they're dominating the rest of the world. There's 2 teams in that Southern Hemisphere that have got something to say about the best team in the world, Chad, right? And they're going to face one of them. They're basically going to face the best team in the world. So that is when we have those 2 tests, that's when we can now chat and say, well, if Ireland can beat South Africa, then we can say, okay, maybe they're the best team in the world. But for now, I think South Africa's on top and actually New Zealand is second. Until Ireland can write off that win from New Zealand in that quarterfinal, they really can't say they're the best team in the world. So that is my opinion on it. Ireland, still play New Zealand at the end of the year. So they will have something to say about this. So we'll have, we can have this chat at the end of the year. But for now, I think the 2 best teams are the World Cup finalists. And, but let me know what you all think about, the performances, about the Six Nations, who you think the best team in the world is. If you think Ireland is justified to be the best team in the world, let's have that conversation. But yeah, so obviously now we move on. We start to watch Super Rugby. We're watching the top 14, URC and all this. So the rugby continues even though the Six Nations is finished. So yeah, we will see you next week. We're going to be talking about other forms, other tournaments, other forms of rugby as well. And yeah, until then, please don't forget to like the video, comment, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. All right, hope you have a great week ahead, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.